PolicyLink, Ashleigh Gardere.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for being with us for the next little while as we talk about a very critical topic, a topic that should be of great concern to everybody who's here at the Essence Festival and at the Global Black Economic Forum. I want to first thank Alfonso David and the Global Black Economic Forum for making this keynote, along with all of the conversations that we've had today and we'll have tomorrow, making it possible. And also just exciting to be here in NOLA at the Essence Festival. Joining me is my colleague and my new friend, Ashleigh Gardere from PolicyLink, and we're just gonna get to it. So we're gonna have a conversation about why it is that we, as Americans, and particularly Black Americans, despite our best efforts to get ahead, to do the best that we can for ourselves and for our families, why we continue to struggle. What are the structural challenges? What are the systemic challenges that actually keep us from getting ahead and what we need to be doing about it? We're gonna talk about structural economic deprivation, and we're gonna talk about how we can begin to take steps that undo structural economic deprivation and set a new foundation in this nation that helps us to not just get by, but to actually thrive. So before we get into the conversation, Ashleigh and I both thought that it was critically important that you have a good sense of who we are, because sometimes you've got people who are talking to you, they're talking at you, and you're like, who are these people? And why should I even listen to what they have to say? So we're gonna take just a couple of minutes to give you a sense of who we are and why we think what we're saying is worth hearing. Ashleigh?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you. Again, I am Ashleigh Gardere. I currently serve as Executive Vice President at PolicyLink. But first and foremost, I'm a New Orleans girl. Grew up here. I can check all those boxes, elementary school, high school, all that. But I think what you should know about me is that my parents actually are not from New Orleans. They made a choice to raise us here. But when they came, we immediately became a part of a church family that was rooted in Black liberation theology. And so from my earliest years, not only did I become a person of deep faith, but that justice was a part of that faith, and how we think about what our responsibility is to other humans was rooted in that framework. And then when I got a little older, I was really blessed to be a student of Jerome Smith, so Jerome Big Duck Smith, who is an honored civil rights leader here in the city of New Orleans. So why that's important is that if my church family taught me about abundance, that I could have not just 2 grandmothers, but 4, then coming up under the tutelage of a local civil rights leader really helped me to understand my power, like that individually and collectively, we have the power to design the systems that we want to see in our city, in our community, in our nation. And so those two things together have been so grounding and have really shaped all of my work. That meant coming back from schools with shiny sheets of paper just in time for Hurricane Katrina. It meant rebuilding, helping to rebuild this city with racial equity at the center of our work. And now to this seat at PolicyLink, where we really are committed to doing the work of redesigning this nation so that it works for everyone. And I know that sounds crazy given these times, but we'll unpack more about why we think that that's actually possible.
So thank you. Exciting to learn these things about you, and it's given me perspective on who you are. And as my children say that, I always say how she's showing up in the world. So how I show up in the world, I like to say that I am a daughter, literally and figuratively, of the civil rights movement. Literally, my father was the president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was the president of the National Economic Justice arm of the Southern Leadership Conference, which was Operation Breadbasket. My grandfather and Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, were roommates at Morehouse College. My father went to Crozet Theological Seminary and was mentored by the same person who mentored Martin Luther King Jr. So I grew up in a household where social justice, black liberation theology, we talked more about that than we did what we were having for dinner. And when you grow up in a household that is steeped in social justice and social justice theology, what then happens for you is that you are, if you will, woke to that from the very beginning. And you learn that your life has purpose.
That's right.
And has meaning, and that your responsibility is to your community. And so that's the life that I was blessed to live from an early childhood. And I went on to get a degree in law. But I learned that the best way that I could use this law degree was that if I centered on what was best for my community. And I've been blessed and privileged to do that now, I'm going to date myself, for better than 30 years. And what I learned along the way is that we can do a lot of work around programs and around policies. But unless we're doing systems and structural work, we're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So here's what's happening right now. We're all watching the news, and we keep being told that the economy is better. But many of us don't feel it. We keep being told that job growth is at a record high, unprecedented, that the Biden administration has added 6.2 million jobs since COVID essentially ended. We've been told that the median household income has gone up, even for Black Americans. We've been told that the unemployment rate is lower than it's ever been, historic lows, and that employment is high, that we are narrowing the unemployment gap, but we haven't yet completely closed it. Now, we're being told all of this, and it's true. But why doesn't it feel like that for us? It doesn't feel like that because costs are greater than they've been. And the resources that we have to meet those costs are not what they should be. So what we're going to talk about is, why is that? Why, when we're doing the best we can to get ahead, we're checking all the boxes the way that they told us to, we still can't get ahead. So Ashleigh, I'm going to begin by asking you, how did we get here as a nation where these traditional, conventional economic indicators don't really tell our story?
So I feel like I've learned a lot in my own professional journey. I talked to you before about the work trying to rebuild New Orleans post-Katrina. A decade later, we then focused particularly on African-American men, and we saw that more than half of our men in this city were not participating in the economy. We did all the smart things, all the best practices that they tell you to, right? To set a broad table of partners, to have data drive your strategy, to have folks with lived experience shape the model, to hold yourselves accountable. We did all those things. We even moved the needle for a little while. And then we've just watched all of that progress really slide back over the years. Beyond the grieving that is necessary, like, what happened? We followed all the rules, we did all the smart things. Why didn't it hold? At the end of the day, we had to come back to our real good training, which is this nation was never designed for us. It wasn't designed for everyone's thriving. And so if we're honest, and I think we're all learning how to just really tell the truth explicitly, it's that at the beginning, we were designing the laws of this nation for white male property owners. That was the design of our economic system. And so then we built our government systems, our rules, our laws towards the thriving of that one population. So if we fast forward the tape back to these hundreds of years till now, what we see is it's working just like it's supposed to. right? We've got one group who's doing well, you know, a handful of white guys that have good jobs, have great health care, who their children have all the supports that they need, the education systems are serving them well, and then so many of the rest of us are struggling. And so at PolicyLink, we talk about an original flawed design. There is a design challenge. And what I had to get right with so many of us who are doing this work is that even when we were doing great work, our best work, the best ideas that we had to offer, they were still inside of the set of rules that we had been given. And so if we want to see something different, now we actually have to tend to the original design. We've got to be willing to say, wait a minute, the core values of this nation actually privilege some over all of us. So now we actually need to articulate values that say, no, 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 we want this thing, we want our government to be in service of all of our thriving. Right. And so that's the long way of saying it wasn't designed for everyone. And that's, you know, sad as that is, the hope and the inspiration that we hold every day is that we can actually redesign these structures of our democracy and our economy towards all of our thriving.
So spot on. I'm reminded as you talk of a line in the opening chapter of a book that my father wrote in 1979, a book titled God in the Ghetto. He began by saying, a simple surface diagnosis of the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology which emanates from a false theology. And what he was saying is that since slavery, remember, slavery was essentially created and then upheld by white Christians. White Christianity that essentially suggested, you know, or I shouldn't say suggested, they essentially put out there that God believed that it was okay to treat black persons as less than. Essentially, they used the Bible to say that God was okay with black persons, Africans, being forever in servitude, that they were cursed as descendants of Ham to be forever in servitude. And what he was saying is that theologically, if you see God, think about this all. What have we all been taught? What does God look like? What have we been told? God is a white image, a white male. So theologically, if God is in the image of a white man, then anthropologically, which is like the evolution of man, if white man is like God, then white man is supreme, right? And then if you sociologically order your society, then you are able to justify, it is legitimate, that white man is most like God, so white male is supreme, and black, and in particular, black woman, sociologically, is on the bottom. And it's okay by God, right? That's the structure. That's the structure. You talk about the system. Simple surface diagnosis of the system. Sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology which emanates from a false theology. Then you go one step farther. I did some work in New York City centered on racial justice, and I was told by the former counsel to Bishop Desmond Tutu to be ever mindful when doing this work that those who created the system created it to persist. And what he was saying to me is be ever mindful that whatever you do to try to dismantle these systems and these structures that uphold inequity and inequality, remember those who designed it for their privilege and for their benefit did it in such a way that they would keep it ever existent. And the last thing I'll say, and then we're going to move on. Audre Lorde, she said, for the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. The master's house is not our only source of support. So how are these systems still in place, despite all of the good work that was done during the civil rights movement? We want you all to have this knowledge because knowledge is power, and knowledge empowers. So we're first going to talk a little bit about narrative. And then we're going to talk about these structures and these systems and what they look like. And then we're going to talk about what we all can do to change it. So let's begin talking a little bit about narrative. And I'm going to set us up, and then we'll go from there. We live in a society where those who have, and our governments included, when they talk about those who don't have, center on basic needs. So think about this. If you are without the resources to do what you need to do to care for your family and you've got to access government support, they're focusing on what you need for housing, what you need with respect to food supports. Maybe you get a child care subsidy, some transportation assistance, Medicaid. If you're older, it's Medicare. It's your basic needs. But basic needs alone do not create for economic security. Economic security is about what you have, what you need, I should say, to meet all of your basic needs, but then to be able to weather a storm. The car breaks down and you don't have to decide between whether or not you're going to pay your rent or you're going to get the car fixed. Economic security is I've got enough to keep food on the table and then to make sure that my child gets tutorial support so my child stays in the game in school. Economic security is I get to save for a rainy day. I get to save for retirement. So the narrative we live with is we just gonna give people what they need just to get by, not to get ahead, not to stay ahead. We're gonna center like they did during slavery on rationing out just enough to make sure your bellies are full, but not so that you can really see a better day. We live in a society that focuses on basic needs and not economic security. And the greatest indication of this is when we talk about wages and not about wealth. It's almost as though wealth is a bad word. Wealth is only reserved for people who have high income, right? For the Jeff Bezoses of the world. Dare I say, for the Robert Smiths of the world. It's like you have to be deserving. You have to have proven yourself to have and hold wealth. But what this society knows, those who are in power know, is that wealth is actually the game changer. It doesn't have to be a whole lot of wealth. But if we talked about low wealth instead of low income, low wealth, just enough that when the car breaks down, you don't have to decide whether you're not going to pay your rent. Just enough that if you want to make sure that you can start saving for your child's future, you can do that. We don't talk about low wealth. The narrative is low income, just enough for us to get by, because they know that wealth is what actually produces economic security. And if you have economic security, you can get by, get ahead, and actually stay ahead. Which is why, and I'll just quickly say, that only, I should say differently, 46% of Americans, and this is white and black Americans, say that they don't even have $500 saved. America is with narrative upholding structural economic deprivation.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what you said about deservedness and the narrative that we get trapped into. So, I talked about the original design challenge and that it wasn't all for all of us. So in those, from our founding, the motto was to create and pick winners and losers, right? Well, when we, inside of that model, coming back to this piece about deservedness, essentially, we end up buying into, when we talk about folks who are low income or struggling, we come back to this notion of like, oh goodness, I lost my thought.
It happens.
Yes, I'm in that zone, y'all. This age group is getting me. Around winners and losers, that if you're on the losing side, it's not by design. It's that you did something wrong, right? And so we get into this space about fixing people. Think about, so my previous work was around building those workforce pathways for Black men in the city. There was an undercurrent of, we gotta fix the people. It's a training program that they need, or we gotta teach them financial literacy. And what was really limiting all of our work and continuing to produce those same outcomes for New Orleans is 300 years old, was that the systems weren't designed for them to thrive. They weren't designed for them to win. And so we don't even, the narratives are so subtle that we get trapped into, even those of us who want to be in service and helping and making sure that we're delivering better outcomes for our people, we're still trapped inside of, we got to fix the people.
Right.
Rather than the systems. And so when you hear us, and we're going to talk more about this, at PolicyLink, we've really shifted our posture away from how do we just pass a policy that makes things incrementally better. First we get a policy win in New Orleans, and then we'll get one in Nashville, and then we'll get one in Dayton, Ohio. Instead, really taking on a new stance that says that the design work of this nation continues. There was not, the founding didn't just happen with that first set of guys in a room with some wigs on and a founder shirt. I wore my founder shirt today. but instead, the founding of this nation continues, and we are responsible for it. And so we'll talk more about it, but from that lens, all of a sudden, we feel powerful enough to redesign the systems themselves, not just color in the lines of here's a workforce program, hope it works for you.
And to your point, if the narrative sticks, despite what you're doing to get ahead, you start doubting yourself.
Yes.
What am I not doing? What am I doing wrong? So it reinforces the negative that they have created.
Yeah.
And if you take it one step farther, something that we used to talk all the time about, we don't talk as much about. Remember going back to the late 90s, now I'm dating myself. You talked about losing your line of thought, I'm dating myself. But in the 90s, when we underwent welfare reform, remember, the welfare mom was the Black woman, right? Even though the great majority of people in America who receive income supports are white Americans, the narrative was that the Black woman was the one who was like hitting up the system and who was engaging in fraud so she could take home some money, get cash assistance, food supports, housing subsidy, because she wasn't doing her part. That was part of the narrative, right? And so I use this term structural economic deprivation, and it's one that I'm continually looking at because what we're doing, or what they're allowing for, it's a way of creating, much like racism, this social construct that allows for these systems to limit our opportunities to get ahead. They place these systemic limitations on what we can do, how we do it, and they normalize it, and then they make it about us when it's really intentional and willful on the part of the power on the part of those who hold and maintain power. So what do these like structures and systems look like? Yeah. It begins with income and wages. Do you know that still today that Black Americans are 2 times more likely to earn a minimum wage than white Americans? Do you know that we still experience occupation segregation disproportionately? Occupation segregation, where we as Black persons, men and women, are more highly concentrated in jobs that pay less. Retail, hospitality, the care economy, So that means like social services and healthcare. And it's by design. What that looks like systemically is when you have black women who are the most educated segment in our society. Despite getting a bachelor's degree, a black woman on average is still likely to earn less than a white man with a high school diploma. A black woman with a master's degree only begins to earn as much as a white man. When she has a master's degree, he's got an associate's degree. So he's still 2 degrees below him. That is like these structural systems that are in place that continue to work against us. So she's doing everything she's supposed to do. But then you layer on top of that debt. So that black woman, think about this. This is what the structure looks like. That black woman goes and gets her degrees because you've told her that that's the way to create a better future for her children, for herself and her future, her children. She goes and she gets that degree. But because of structural and systemic inequities that have not allowed for us to build and transfer wealth from one generation to the next, she's got to take out debt. She's got to take out student loans to get those degrees. Yeah. So now she gets those degrees because you told her that was what she needed to do. But now she's making on average 63 cents on the dollar compared to what white men make. White women 79 cents, so she's making significantly less. But she's got more debt, right? And then let's add that she's the primary breadwinner because of other inequities that you can speak so thoughtfully to, and I want you to. She's the primary breadwinner in nearly 70% of households. So what does that look like now? She makes less money. She's got debt she's got to repay. She can't save because she's making less money and she's got to pay off her student loans. She can't save for her retirement, so now she's going to have less money when she gets up in her years, right? She can't save to put her child through college or children, so they're going to have to take out more debt, right? She can't save for like inconvenient, unexpected circumstances. So then what happens? 1 in 3 black children grows up living in poverty compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. That is structural economic deprivation at work. Using the systems that are in place to keep her from saving and building some wealth which she needs to weather economic storms. Help us appreciate how justice and injustice plays into this.
Well, I was actually also just thinking about the work that we did. I told you we were focused on black men's thriving. This is the first time, think about it, we're in the American South, and I worked for a mayor who was willing to be explicit about a population and have a race-based strategy. And so I was just thinking as you were sharing that story about what we learned about black men's stories and their journey, which was, so that was a losing story there.
Right.
And then on the side of black men, what we were seeing is that before they could even start, so first of all, our education system didn't deliver all that it was promised. I don't know if you all remember, but after Katrina, our school system was taken over. We had a state takeover, all of our schools became charter, and the promise was all of our schools would be A+ schools. That didn't quite happen. So first of all, we have education that didn't deliver all of what it promised. Then our criminal justice system was removing 43%. So when we started, we were talking about a population of 38,600 black men who were not working. That was 52% of black men who were working age. And when we got into the numbers, we discovered, and then 43% of that 38,000 had criminal convictions. This goes back to what I was saying about, are we fixing the people, or are we fixing the systems? Because it looks like the systems are actively working to pull folks out of a pathway to prosperity. So that was just on the this criminalizing side. But then 25% of our black men, working age black men, were technically homeless, meaning not necessarily living on the street, but living with family and friends, no permanent address. So those are just two examples. So no, three. Education, right? Then we've got the justice system. Then we've got unstable housing. And all of that is not unrelated to the black woman's story that you just described,
Absolutely.
right? So then we have a public housing system that says, oh, wait a minute, that man can't live in that unit with you with the housing voucher. So not only is she struggling and not rewarded for what she did, she's also lonely.
That's right. That's right.
So I just couldn't, I wanted to make sure we were looking at the fullness of the black experience, both through the lens of women and also our men. And all of that inside of these structures that were designed to exclude. And so when now coming back to this question about justice, I don't know that there's much more to say besides it's unjust.
Right.
And so that's when I talk about choosing to take this founder stance. At some point, we have to be willing to yes, all the data tells us that stuff, but then we've got to be able to share our stories and say, you know what, it's enough with that. And it's not enough just to declare Juneteenth a holiday and us to get distracted and say, oh yeah, they gave us something. No. We're now going to, from this founder's position, decide that it is up to us to redesign our democracy, to redesign our economy so that it actually, we're no longer taking these two stories as the norm and as acceptable behavior.
Right. And to that point, just to bring it all the way through, what we need to hold on to, and like, you know, and I'm staying in this space, I'm not letting it go, is that this is all intentional. It's willful.
Yes.
So Dr. King, you know, when we talk about the March on Washington, you ever notice it is just spoken of as the March on Washington?
Right.
The full title of the March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Yes.
Economic justice was as vital and as crucial as civil rights and civil liberties. But that little jobs and freedom, that's conveniently left off because they don't want you to center on that. When Dr. King began leading the Poor People's Campaign, what he was beginning to understand was that America was essentially upholding structural economic deprivation. As a little girl, my daddy taught me that we find ourselves thinking we're fighting racism. We find ourselves thinking that racism is just for racism's sake. Racism, much like sexism and misogyny, exists to uphold in America structural economic deprivation. The end game is to keep those who have having and those who do not have from ever attaining. And what I want you to hear is that what we have to appreciate is that income alone, they wanted us to think, just work harder. Just get your degrees and you'll be better. Income alone won't cut it. Wealth in America is the gateway to economic security. And as long as they can keep people, whites included, but disproportionately black Americans, from ever getting a little bit of wealth, you will live economically insecure and you'll never have the power that you should have, and you will always feel that you're in a state of struggle and insecurity, and you'll be off your game. That's how they want us to think about it. So there's something we can do here. There's work that can be done. And it begins, as you said, with centering on power. The power that we have to imagine something differently. To not, as you said, fix people, but fix systems.
So, you know, we were trying to think about, all of that sounds good. What does it look like? And so one of the things that, you know, when we talked about this notion of a founder stance, we got busy thinking about what comes before you create a policy, right? So somebody shows up, all our elected officials, they either go into the legislative branch and they have a policy idea and then they find enough people to support it and they pass the law. But there's got to be something that comes before that actually holds to a different set of values. We're telling a whole different story here than what the nation was designed to do. And so one of the examples that we've been really working on is this notion of, we call it legislative scoring. Legislative scoring. The idea is before you even get to introduce a policy for passage, you actually have to say who wins and who loses. So when you're constructing your policy, you're saying, okay, so whether it's around race or gender or geography, who's actually going to be better off and who's going to be worse off? Can you imagine? Like, that's actually possible. So we have a Congressional Budget Office, just for example, who right now, whenever somebody introduces a potential bill, they do a cost-benefit analysis on it. How much is it going to cost the United States government to execute this thing? And so what we're saying is, oh, we really like that model. Actually, let's do that for winners and losers. And so this is one practical example of how we can actually show up and reshape the governing process, holding people accountable for saying from the beginning, I know that these are the folks who I'm in service of. And all of them aren't going to be all of us, but at least if we tell the truth about it, then us, the people in this room, can hold folks accountable for the decisions that they make. And we can choose to continue to elect folks who are serving in our interests and help offer an invitation for folks to sit down who are not.
Absolutely. One of the things that I am fortunate to work with Ashleigh and PolicyLink on, and a growing coalition of nonprofit organizations, policy civil rights organizations, is something called the National True Cost of Living. Sitting up here earlier today were Mark Morial of the National Urban League and Reverend Al Sharpton from National Action Network. I should say I'm the vice chair of the board of National Action Network, and I'm very, very proud of that. They have joined with us and several other institutions to do something that has never been done before, that can begin to change the game, change the structural foundation. Now, keep in mind, I keep on centering on structural economic deprivation.
Yes.
Let me give you an example of how this is held up every single day in America and how we all can do something about it. Mm-hmm. In America, we have something called the official poverty measure. Mm-hmm. The official poverty measure is a measure that was created back in the early 60s that essentially establishes the cost of living in America, what it costs to meet your basic needs. Now, this measure says, you all ready for this? This measure says that an individual, one person, a household of one, living anywhere in America, New Orleans, Atlanta, Georgia, Wichita, Kansas, Greensboro, South Carolina, Brooklyn, New York, an individual needs just $15,600 to technically not be poor, to meet their basic needs. That if you have $15,600, you're not poor in America as an individual. This official poverty measure says that a family of 4 living anywhere in America needs just $30,000 to not be poor technically. 2 adults, 2 children needs just $30,000 to not be poor. Now, this is how this works. The federal minimum wage in America still today is $7.25 an hour. When that $7.25 is annualized, somebody working full-time all year, that amounts to $15,000. So lo and behold, if you've got 2 adults in a household and they're making federal minimum wage, 15,000 times 2 is 30,000. They're not poor. They use that measure to make determinations about eligibility for a child care subsidy, Head Start, for transportation assistance, for food supports, cash assistance, Medicaid eligibility. It's the most effective way of ensuring that those who do not have significant income continue to struggle. It is structural economic deprivation. And what it does is it centers on acute deprivation. What that means is the minimum of what you need to just get by. It says nothing about the debt that we all have. How much we have in student loans, credit cards. If we're fortunate to have bought something here or there, how much it costs to pay that back. It says nothing about what we need to address medical debt we have, incidental healthcare, out-of-pocket healthcare costs. It doesn't factor in what it means to save for a rainy day, right? If we lose our jobs and we got to get by for a couple of months, 6 months, a year. It doesn't include savings for retirement. And so in doing, essentially it allows some people to stay at the bottom forever and to never get ahead despite our hard work. So what we've come up with is a movement, a campaign to create for this nation a true cost of living. What it truly costs in America to live with economic security. What it means to meet your basic needs, but to also have enough money to save for your retirement, to save to be able to care for your children, and maybe even for your parents. What it means to save to buy that car that you're gonna need to get to your job. What it means, what it costs to pay down your debt. That all of those costs have to be factored in. And let's go one step farther. That not just kind of what it looks like for the nation across the board, but what those costs look like in New Orleans, what they look like in Decatur, Georgia, what it looks like if you're down south, what it looks like if you're living up in Massachusetts. To go county by county and look at these costs and then turn and say to America, this is the true cost of living in my county. And you can no longer set wages based on what you know is an artificial, fake, low, suppressed number. You can no longer determine my eligibility for critical income supports. You have to allow for us to build economic security. Why are you all in this?
Yeah, so I wanted to make the connection between why this is so important and why we care about it. So you just heard Jennifer talk about the true cost of living. I told you before about the legislative scoring initiative. I'm going to just stick with this example. So the very first time we tested the scoring methodology, we tested it on Social Security program. Not because we're experts in Social Security, but because it's one of those federal laws that applies to all of us. So long as we live, we're going to get to a point where we're in a conversation with ourselves about Social Security and how big our check is. And when we tested what it would look like around Social Security expansion, like what if we made improvements to Social Security, what would the outcomes be when we score it? Well, what we saw was that expansion actually allowed everybody to be better off, but it didn't close the gap. It didn't close the gap. So white folks were still doing better than black folks and brown folks. And so it then brought us right back to this question about, well, what are the lives that we've lived up until we get to the time of Social Security? All those things Jennifer just talked about, well, we got paid less. And we didn't have the same medical care or medical insurance. And our child care costs were different. And that whole list. And so one of the things that excites me about this age, this era that we're in, is that we're going back to what was modeled before us, that our institutions have got to be joining forces and in service. We call it transformative solidarity. We actually have to be in this work together, recognizing what each of our roles are. So you have seen how brilliant Jennifer is in leading this work and making sure that there is a national campaign. And then we've got a role to play, right? We're in our lane actually making the connection to that work. And so it may seem like a little point, but it's not small, because I think we've all of us who are in this work know that we can either choose to stand with each other or get distracted by fighting with each other and all
right.
of that stuff. And so we have decided that this work of the campaign is so critical because it does. Keep coming back to this founder stance. The true cost of living sets a new expectation. Jennifer talked before about, number one, there's got to be a new narrative about what we all deserve, what we have a right to, but then new values and a new set of measures.
That's right.
For us, that is the picture of governing for all. That's why we're in it.
Absolutely. And what I didn't share, but I want you all to appreciate is we ran with this in New York City. So I was, and I'm going to say I was blessed. I was blessed to lead in New York City a racial justice commission to look at how we could go into the New York City Charter, which is our Constitution. This was following the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. How we could go into our New York City Constitution and begin to dismantle structural racism in our laws, our policies, our programs, in the levers of government, budgeting, hiring, promotions, delivery of services. And so one of the things that we did was to stand up a preamble to declare New York City a multiracial democracy where everybody, regardless of race, religion, immigration status, gender identity, sexual orientation, we all are entitled to the best that New York City has to offer. And our government is responsible for making sure that we all have access and fair and equal opportunity. We didn't have a preamble. So the government was just wilding for 300 years on its own, doing whatever it wanted to do. We didn't have a preamble to set a value base as you're talking about. And then to your point, we stood up an Office of Racial Equity that is going to require on a biannual basis that every city agency, including the fire department, the police department, put together racial equity plans and be held accountable to them. But the third thing that we did was to put on the ballot, and we sent it to the New York City electorate, the voters, to decide upon all of these measures. The third thing was that New York City annually calculate what it truly costs to live in New York City, to then use that to push the government, New York City government, to make sure that its policies, its programs were responsive. That you can't just say that if you've been doling out child care based on what they call 200% of poverty, I'm going to take you back to that official poverty measure, that if you're a mother with 2 young children, the official poverty measure says that if you make, I think it's now up to $24,000, 200% of poverty would be $48,000. Once you get above $48,000, now your ability to access child care subsidy drops significantly. A true cost of living could say that that mother could be making $80,000 and still be in need of a child care subsidy. You get what I'm saying? So we put it to the New York City electorate. Do you know those New Yorkers came back? Black, brown, white, Republican, Democrat, affluent, middle income, lower income? 81% said we need a true cost of living measure in New York City. Because what's happening right now is it's not just the lowest income people. People, many of you possibly, middle income earners are struggling. We need a true cost of living in this nation. We did a national poll. The national poll has said 89% of Americans are saying we need a true cost of living in this nation because we need to reset the foundation. As long as our government is using a poverty measure centered on deprivation, they're never acknowledging what we need by way of wages and income, what we need by way of income supports, how our systems and structures need to help us to pay down our debt and create the opportunity to actually save and build wealth. So, Ashleigh's talked, I appreciate so much of you said about how we've got to change mindset for us all to see and believe that something more is possible. When we did this work in New York City, people were telling us we could fail. It would never be done. We couldn't change the Constitution. Well, we wrote the new measures, but then we came out and we voted for them. And now they're law. We changed the foundation. We can change the way we measure need and economic security in this nation, we've got to have a true cost of living.
Yeah.
And you all, individuals, the associations with which you're acquainted, be they churches, perhaps sororities, frats, other institutions, you can join the True Cost of Living campaign. You can demand of your electeds, why aren't we measuring what it truly costs to live in this nation? And steer them to the National True Cost of Living campaign, to what New York City did. It's a way to reset the foundation, to say to people, we know what's up here. We know that you want us to live continually in economic deprivation, and you're going to use these systems to keep us from ever getting there. So you can go to nationaltruecostofliving.org, learn about the campaign there, and then tell people about it. Sign up and engage, because we need these electeds to understand we're not playing checkers anymore. We're playing chess. And we know that what you're doing at every turn is trying to keep us from having the resources that we need to actually live and be economically secure.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is what we've seen is that the success that you led in New York actually is getting taken up. I want you to just know it's not theoretical. Folks in New Orleans, there's a set of regular folks, regular organizations who have seen that and say, you know what, we need to get into that. And so when we thought about like a useful call to action for this conversation, it's just a reminder that we get to decide. And so even when you go back home, that there's a place. You can go to your community organization and say, have you actually checked out that True Cost of Living campaign? There's something to that, right? So we don't want to just be in theoretical conversations anymore. We really want to get to moving this work.
Absolutely, absolutely. So check that out, nationaltruecostofliving.org, and be a part of the coalition that is going to move this nation to reset the foundation, to center us on economic security and not just deprivation. And that is what will begin to set the wheels in motion. So we're going to conclude. One of the things that is difficult in these moments is change doesn't come overnight. And especially when you're trying to change these systems that have been in place, these structures for centuries at a time. So I'm just going to quickly ask you, because we got some people out there who are willing to do the work as well. What sustains you?
Actually, this vision of an America that serves all of us. That is worth getting up every day and fighting for. We often have inside of our organization, but also with our partners, folks are like, well, y'all talking about a founder stance and how are we going to deliver for all? And are we going back to an all conversation? Because I feel like Black folks, brown folks, we haven't won yet. And so you're asking me to do something when I'm still experiencing trauma. Literally, we're all watching the news. We're seeing what's happening, and it is harmful to us and our spirits. And so folks are like, well, don't we need to heal first? And I think what I've come to is that we don't actually have time for a chronological order. I'm going to heal first, and then I'm going to be ready, and I'm going to get back in there. What I've discovered is that my healing is coming inside the work.
I love it.
That there's something about me accepting responsibility and agency, owning my power, that thing that Jerome Smith taught me when I was 14 years old, that actually matters. Every morning when I get up, that I recognize that there is something that I can do to transform this nation into something we've never been. The promises were always there. We just never really intended them. So what sustains me is the bigness, I'll say, of the vision and my belief that it can actually be realized with folks like us.
I love it.
Doing this work together. But I would just implore us, all of us who do this work every day, all day, consider that we don't have to step out first and get ourselves together and come back, but that our healing can come inside of the work and delivering for us, our cousins, our aunties, our daddies, our mamas, who are living this with us every day.
You know, what I so appreciate everything that you said, and I'm ever reminded that, you know, in this moment where there's so many threats, I'm going to go beyond. They're not threats. These are actually now becoming realities, right? You know, it's not just a threat that they've taken our voting protections away, right? Our voter protections, that they've dismantled affirmative action, that they've now, you know, like they're eroding DEI, which never was legislated. It was just kind of like a structural reset, if you will. And that, you know, we've now seen that we've got presidential immunity for official acts that one can determine of their own what is an official act and what is not. The threats are real. They're happening. But the threats were real
That's right.
during slavery.
That's right.
And somehow Harriet Tubman found a way.
Yes.
Sojourner
19
Truth
times.
found a way. I am ever reminded that we have been built to do hard things.
Yes.
There was no DEI when Sojourner Truth was moving, Harriet Tubman, Shirley Chisholm,
Yes.
right? Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, like the list goes on. There was no DEI. When Al Sharpton was getting started, there was no DEI,
That's right.
right? We've been built to do hard things.
Yes.
And once you've learned you can do hard things,
You can do more hard things.
you can do more hard things. We have a Juneteenth because a little black woman in Texas believed she
That's
had
right.
voice,
Yes.
believed she had power, and she made it possible. That's the mindset that we have to live with. And the last thing that I'll share that sustains me. You heard me begin by talking about, my father and being engaged in the civil rights movement. He was a faith leader. I'm fourth generation. I call myself a leader of faith. I believe very strongly that every single one of us has life to fulfill purpose. And as long as we are here, we're living with purpose. So it's just up to us to live into that. We may not know exactly what it is, but just be in furtherance of that purpose and know that as people who, because of the color of our skin, we are committed to a calling greater than ourselves. We've been placed here to do a certain thing, to liberate not just ourselves, but each other.
That's right.
Live in that purpose and you're gonna find some strength. So check out the True Cost of Living campaign, and thank you for being a part of this conversation with us.
And thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you, all that you're doing. Thank you all.